November 18, 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. A train screeched to a stop in the freezing dawn. Dozens of Japanese soldiers stepped out, thin, silent, and certain they were walking into hell. They'd been told Americans would starve them, beat them, maybe kill them, but instead, they smelled hamburgers sizzling on hot grills. They saw guards laughing, sharing Coca-Cola bottles, and doctors treating wounds with care. In that moment, the men who expected torture found kindness, and it broke something deep inside them. What happened next would change how they saw the war and the enemy forever. If you enjoy true World War II stories told with real emotion and detail, hit subscribe, like, and stay till the end of this video, because this story is one you won't forget. The freight cars halted with a metallic groan that seemed to echo across the snow-covered Wisconsin hills. The air outside was sharp enough to burn the lungs, a shock after weeks sealed in steel. The Japanese prisoners of war stepped down one by one, boots thudding on frozen ground, breath clouding like smoke. Behind them, the train hissed and settled, its heat evaporating into the November air. They had travelled nearly a month from the Pacific Theatre, from Guam to Hawaii, then across the American continent. Each stage was a deeper plunge into enemy territory, the monster America they had been warned about. Military indoctrination had taught them capture was the worst dishonour imaginable. Better to die by your own hand than fall into the hands of the enemy, one officer had said before the Saipan surrender. Yet here they were, alive, hungry, and utterly unsure what would come next. At Camp McCoy, army guards in thick coats waited with rifles slung but fingers far from triggers. A white banner marked prisoner of war reception area. The camp sprawled across 60,000 acres of snow and pine, barbed wire glinting under the winter sun. It held nearly 4,000 Japanese prisoners by late 1944, part of the 50,000 sent to the continental United States before war's end. The first paradox appeared at the gates. The men expected snarling guards. Instead, they met silence and paperwork. Name, rank, serial number, an interpreter repeated. Each man was logged, not beaten. Medical corpsmen checked temperatures, handed out wool blankets. "Keep this," one said, pressing a steaming tin of coffee into shaking hands. The taste of sugar and heat nearly made one man weep. Inside the processing hall, the smell of disinfectant mixed with the faint sweetness of oatmeal. A sergeant ordered, "Remove uniforms," and the men braced for humiliation. Instead, clean fatigues were issued, marked PW in white paint. They were instructed how to wash, how to keep lice at bay, how to report illness. One recalled later in a Tokyo interview, "It was the first time in months I was treated as if my life still had value." In the barracks, wooden stoves burned low. Prisoners sat wordless on bunks, listening to the crackle of kindling and the muffled rumble of a distant train. Through frosted glass, they could see Americans walking freely, guards laughing, boots crunching in the snow. It was ordinary life, and it frightened them more than cruelty could have. For weeks they had been prepared for torture. What they met was order, abundance, and a quiet efficiency that defied the image they carried from home front propaganda posters, grotesque cartoons of Devil America. The realization came slowly. Their captors had no interest in revenge. The Americans were following the Geneva Convention, Article 11, full rations equal to US troops, humane treatment, medical care. At night, one soldier scribbled in his notebook, "We have been fed lies. The enemy's camp is cleaner than our barracks in Manchuria." The words were a private heresy, but a seed had been planted. The fear did not vanish overnight. They whispered about hidden motives. Why such treatment? Were they being softened for interrogation or filmed for propaganda? But the days passed without punishment. The meals arrived on time, and the guards spoke little but never raised their voices. The certainty that America was monstrous began to crumble under something far more dangerous: doubt. Outside, the snow deepened. Trucks carried supplies between warehouses, and the rhythmic clang of the mess hall bell carried across the yard. Some men pressed their faces to the window, smelling cooked meat for the first time in months. None could imagine what awaited them inside that building, a meal that would break their discipline and redefine what victory and defeat meant. But that moment was coming soon. and when it arrived, it would shatter the last certainty they had brought from the islands of war. Steam filled the intake building, rolling through the cracks of the wooden walls like ghostly fog. The men filed in under guard, ordered to strip and hand over their uniforms, lice-ridden, rain-stained remnants of campaigns long lost. Each garment fell into a wire bin and disappeared into a vat of boiling water. For men raised on military codes where surrender equaled disgrace, the scene felt unbearable. Nakedness was exposure, cleansing was humiliation. Yet the Americans seemed indifferent to shame. They moved briskly, with practiced precision, as if washing thousands of soldiers was routine, because it was. A medic sprayed DDT powder into armpits, hair and boots. "For lice," he muttered, as though explaining to an equal. Another handed out soap-stamped US Army. The smell, sharp, chemical but clean, was dizzying after months of jungle grime. "We were treated like sick men, not captured beasts," remembered Private Hiroshi Ueda in a 1946 interview with Asahi Shimbun. Each man received a set of olive-drab fatigues, socks and heavy jackets marked in bold white letters. PW. They looked alien in the mirror, the proud imperial uniforms replaced by American fabric. But the clothes were warm. The itch of wool replaced the constant cold. Outside, a truck dumped boxes of Red Cross supplies. Toothbrushes, razors, even tins of condensed milk. "Why?" one officer asked an interpreter. The man shrugged. "Because it is the rule." The rule, the Geneva Convention, seemed unreal, a myth enforced with bureaucratic calm. The prisoners were weighed and logged. 117 pounds average, many under 100. Doctors noted malnutrition, scabies, trench foot. Within 2 weeks, calorie intake tripled from starvation levels to 3,000 calories a day, nearly equal to US soldiers. "They fed us like athletes," one recalled. "It confused us more than punishment could have." For the first time, they saw the camp's internal order, a hospital ward with sterilized instruments, bunks lined with fresh straw, shelves of medicine labeled in English. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, a sound foreign to men who had lived by candle or moonlight. The contrast was almost cruel. When the delousing ended, they were led outside again into the crisp Wisconsin wind. It smelled of pine and distant smoke from the kitchens. They expected the usual barking commands. Instead, a sergeant said evenly, "You'll be taken to your quarters. Supper in an hour." Supper. The word hung like a spell. In the barracks, men whispered. Could it be true? Would they really eat with Americans? The idea felt absurd. Propaganda had said prisoners starved in cages, that Americans laughed while they suffered. Yet through the thin walls they heard laughter, utensils clinking, and something that sounded like bottles being opened. When the mess hall bell rang, it startled everyone. The line formed quickly, boots crunching on icy gravel. A corporal counted them off, not as enemies, but as entries on a ledger. Inside, warmth and smell collided, grilled meat, onions, and the yeasty tang of bread. The odour alone was enough to make them dizzy. One prisoner later wrote, "The smell was unbearable, not because it was bad, but because it was human." For men who had lived on millet and thin soup, the sight of hamburgers on metal trays looked like hallucination. Brown patties hissed on griddles, bread buns steamed in bins. On the counter sat rows of glass bottles. Coca-Cola, the forbidden icon of American life. No one spoke. Hands shook as the trays were passed down the line. The first bite silenced the room. Meat juice and salt, bread soft against the tongue, sugar fizz stinging the throat. The taste of everything they'd been told America had stolen from the world. Some smiled, others low. Read their heads in shame, tears rolled without sound. That night, as frost gathered on the barracks windows, Sergeant Nakayama wrote in his notebook, "We were conquered not by bombs or bullets, but by a meal." But the meal was only the beginning. The days ahead would test their understanding of captivity and of dignity in ways even more profound than hunger and fear. The next morning, the camp stirred before dawn. Frost glistened on the wire fences, and the smell of bacon and coffee drifted across the compound like a taunt. For men who had eaten starvation rations since Guadalcanal, it was impossible to ignore. They rose quietly, some from dreams of rice paddies, others from the dull ache of disbelief. The mess hall became the camp's heartbeat. 3 times a day, the same ritual unfolded. Trays sliding down the line, cooks in white aprons moving with factory precision. Each meal became an emotional ambush. Every plate was a reminder that what we believed about America could not be true, wrote Corporal Tadashi Murata, whose diary later surfaced in a Tokyo archive. On the 3rd day, hamburgers returned, thick, seared, glistening with fat. The soldiers stared as if studying a symbol, not a food. The hamburger had appeared on American factory lines only a few decades earlier, but by 1944 it was the quintessential emblem of US abundance: beef, bread, condiments, calories. To men who had fought for an empire running out of rice, it was surreal excess. A statistic recorded by the US Army Quartermaster Corps helps explain their astonishment. Each POW in the continental camps received an average of 3.25 pounds of food per day, nearly double what Japanese troops had been issued on Pacific Islands by 1945. It wasn't generosity alone, it was logistics. America's wartime food output exceeded £100 billion annually, enough to feed 2 armies and a home front still thriving under ration books. One prisoner, Desky, bribed his first Coke bottle as a weapon made of sugar. He couldn't open it. His hands trembled too much. A guard offered help, tapping the cap gently against the table. The hiss and fizz filled the air, followed by a smell of caramel and cold metal. The man lifted it to his lips and felt the sting of bubbles. "I cried," he admitted later, "because I realized this was what victory tasted like." The mess hall servers weren't soldiers but civilian kitchen staff, middle-aged men and women in aprons. They smiled, nodded, said things the prisoners didn't understand. Yet the rhythm of service, line, tray, food, thank you, felt eerily familiar. It was discipline of another kind, not military but social. For some prisoners, it triggered guilt. To eat so well while Japan burned under American firebombs felt like betrayal. Rumors spread that they were being fattened for display, that cameras would come to show the world how kindly the US treated its captives. The irony cut deep. Propaganda had taught them to scorn American comfort, yet here they were, craving it. At night, the barracks smelled of cooked grease and detergent, the air thick with the hum of fluorescent bulbs. Men lay awake, chewing phantom flavors, whispering about wives and mothers who would not believe them if they described this. To tell the truth, one wrote, would be to shame them. The mess hall did more than feed bodies. It dismantled ideology. The American guards never lectured, never gloated. Their quiet efficiency said everything. When one guard joked that the POWs ate better than he did, laughter rippled down the line. Awkward, hesitant, but real. There were subtle cruelties too, not from malice, but from contrast. One week, the prisoners were served buttered rolls beside jam and canned peaches. A few could not finish. The sweetness was too intense. Others pocketed scraps of bread to doctor. Ian Keep, afraid it might all vanish. By February 1945, routine had replaced terror. Men lined up on time, exchanged cautious nods with guards, even requested seconds when permitted. The enemy became a man who could cook, wrote one officer, and that was more dangerous than a man who could shoot. It was not indulgence that broke them, but normalcy. They had lived so long under extremity that kindness felt like disarmament. As the snow began to melt and the Wisconsin mud returned beneath their boots, something in them began to soften as well. Yet with comfort came a harder question. If the enemy treated them as human, what did that make the empire that had promised to die for their honor? The answer would haunt them long after the plates were cleared. But outside the mess hall, a new rhythm awaited. The work details, the canteen, the strange economy of captivity that would show them how even prisoners could live in a land of plenty. By early spring 1945, Camp McCoy had thawed into motion. The snow retreated from the pine fences, and the compound began to breathe again. Trucks rumbled over muddy tracks, guards leaned against posts smoking cigarettes, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the faint sweetness of maple from the woods beyond. Inside the wire, the prisoner's world had settled into a rhythm so stable it was almost comforting, and that comfort was its own kind of torment. The men rose at 6:00 a.m. to the clang of the morning bell. They folded their blankets, scrubbed their barracks, lined up for roll call. Work assignments came next. Each prisoner was issued a numbered tag and sent to small details around the base, clearing snow, stacking lumber, or, for the skilled, repairing fences and engines. It wasn't forced labour in the old sense. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could work but had to be paid. And so they were, 80 cents a day, not in cash, but in canteen coupons. Those coupons became a strange currency. At the camp store, men could trade them for razor blades, stationery, tobacco, candy, and occasionally the forbidden marvel, Coca-Cola. We could buy chocolate, one prisoner later recalled. Real chocolate, which I had never tasted before the war. Some wrote home boasting, half in shame, half in disbelief, that American prisoners were richer than Japanese civilians. The canteen shelves were a museum of peacetime goods. Soap boxes printed with bright red lettering, tins of coffee, chewing gum in rows like military ranks. To men raised on scarcity, it was dizzying. We learned that even the smallest item, a bar of soap, a piece of candy, represented the strength of their industry, wrote Lieutenant Kiyoshi Ono in a 1947 memoir. Work outside the wire was equally surreal. Under armed supervision, select groups were driven to nearby farms to cut timber, pick potatoes, or repair barns damaged by storms. Local farmers, desperate for help with sons away at war, came to rely on them. They called us the boys, one POW said decades later. We were prisoners, but they talked to us like neighbors. Wisconsin newspapers even reported that farmers sometimes left lunches for the POWs, sandwiches, milk, apples. It was technically against regulations, but guards looked away. The interaction humanized both sides. It also carried the subtle sting of humiliation. Being fed again by one's conquerors, even with kindness, reminded them of defeat. Every afternoon, the men returned to camp, their boots caked in mud, their minds filled with questions they couldn't voice. One said to another in the barracks that night, "If this is how the enemy lives, how could we have ever hoped to win?" The other only stared at the glowing stove and muttered, "Maybe we were never meant to." The numbers told the story. By 1945, the United States operated over 400 POW camps across its territory, holding more than 425,000 Axis prisoners, Germans, Italians, and about 5,000 Japanese. Each camp followed similar routines, each enforced humane standards that had become an unexpected weapon of ideology. Inside Camp McCoy, a small notice board displayed schedules in Japanese and English, mealtimes, roll call, work lists, and Sunday religious services. The guards enforced order with quiet professionalism. Punishments were rare and mild. Extra duty, loss of privileges. Violence was unnecessary when routine itself could reshape thought. The camp even printed a mimeographed newsletter, the McCoy Times, featuring baseball scores and weather reports. Some prisoners practiced English using the clippings. One discovered a headline about the Pacific Front, "Tokyo bombed again." He folded the paper slowly, tucking it into his jacket as if to protect it from the air. Even leisure was regulated. In the evenings, the men played Go or shogi on boards carved from scrap wood. Others sat near the stove, polishing boots that no longer needed to shine. In spring, guards organized baseball games between German and Japanese prisoners, a spectacle of surreal camaraderie. The sound of bat-meeting ball echoed across the camp, a reminder that war had boundaries even inside captivity. The coupons, the canteen, the predictable rhythm of meals, all these things formed a mirror of American society. Work, reward, consumption. And within that mirror, the prisoners saw a reflection that made their own empire's deprivations harder to justify. As April arrived, the air warmed, and the camp's fences no longer looked like cages, but borders of a strange, temporary nation. Yet the true transformation was happening not in routine, but in language, in the hesitant words traded between guards, and prisoners, the soft bridges of speech that turned enemies into something uncomfortably close to friends. By May 1945, the camp had begun to sound different. English words, once foreign as static, now drifted through the barracks, halting and uneven, like a child learning to walk. "Good morning. Thank you. How are you?" The voices were tentative but genuine. What had started as mimicry became communication, and with communication came the slow erosion of walls that barbed wire couldn't hold. It began with the classes. The American Red Cross supplied chalkboards, pencils, and paper. The camp command approved voluntary English lessons 3 evenings a week. A chaplain and 2 civilian volunteers taught vocabulary using picture cards: cup, table, tree, sky. The first word the prisoners requested was home. The second was mother. Soon, even the guards took part. Sergeant Robert Ellis, who had been stationed at Camp McCoy since 1943, later recalled, "They were the most polite students I ever had. They'd bow after every answer. But what struck me most was their hunger. Not for food this time, but for understanding." Through the exchange of words came the exchange of humanity. A guard showing a family photograph would say, "wife," and the prisoner would nod and reply, "Tsuma." They'd trade cigarettes, gum, and small gestures that carried more weight than diplomacy. In the canteen line, one young POW, barely 20, once asked in broken English, "You fight in Pacific?" The guard hesitated. "No," he said softly. "My brother did." There was a pause, heavy, mutual, wordless. Then the prisoner bowed slightly and said, "I'm sorry." It wasn't clear for whom. Language made the war personal. It turned anonymous enemies into individual men. Yet for many POWs, that was precisely what made it unbearable. They had been raised to see Americans as faceless invaders, cruel, decadent, godless. Now they were discovering that kindness could exist without propaganda, that warmth could live inside a uniform-marked US Army. The paradox deepened each day. They were prisoners, yet they were freer than some had ever felt in uniform. "I learned English and chess in that camp," recalled Private First Class Kenji Aoki, interviewed in 1982. "Back home, such leisure was unthinkable. I began to fear peace as much as war." The camp's recreation yard became a strange social experiment. Baseball, introduced by American guards, spread like wildfire. Japanese prisoners took to the sport with military precision, measuring field distances, crafting gloves from canvas, carving bats from pine. Before long, they were hosting matches against the German compound across the field. The sight was almost absurd, Axis soldiers cheering each other under the American flag. The sensory world of the camp had shifted too. Gone were the smells of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. Now came the scent of fresh-cut grass, engine oil, sun-baked wood. Radios from the guardhouse carried Glenn Miller's Swing, mixing with laughter and the soft click of go pieces in the shade. It was an environment designed, perhaps unintentionally, to heal. But not everyone welcomed the transformation. Among the prisoners, whispers of betrayal grew louder. The older officers, still loyal to the imperial code, called the English learners kusa, weeds, spreading disloyal ideas. They accused them of forgetting Japan's suffering, of letting comfort erase purpose. "A soldier's mind must not be fed American sugar," one warned. The camp command watched quietly, aware of the tension but unwilling to interfere. It was a psychological contest that required no intervention. The simple existence of American normalcy was winning the argument more effectively than lectures ever could. Statistics supported this subtle victory. By mid-1945, over 70% of POWs in US custody were participating in voluntary education programs, literacy, languages, trades. Japanese prisoners were fewer in number, but matched the enthusiasm, turning captivity into an unintentional classroom for cultural exchange. One evening, a guard lent his dictionary to a group of students. On the inside cover, he had written a single line in pencil. "The war will end, but words will remain." The prisoners passed it around, tracing the letters with their fingers. And when, weeks later, a radio crackled with news that Germany had surrendered, cheers erupted from the German compound. The Japanese men only listened in silence, understanding that their own reckoning was near. They had learned new words, new customs, even new empathy. But their empire was collapsing, and the language of mercy was about to meet the language of defeat. The winds over Camp McCoy grew warmer, and the pine trees swayed under a softer sun. Yet under that peace, a storm of shame and doubt began to rise, one that no act of kindness could fully quiet. By August 1945, the war had shifted from rumor to ending. In the canteen line, talk of home replaced talk of rations. Some men whispered about Okinawa, others about the bombing of Tokyo, all through a veil of disbelief, as if the homeland existed only in old photographs. Then came August 6th. The news reached Camp McCoy through the radio in the administrative office. An atomic bomb has been dropped on Hiroshima. The voice was calm, American, professional. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. Within an hour, the prisoners knew. At first, no one believed it. A single bomb destroying an entire city sounded like Allied propaganda. But as the reports grew clearer, fires, hospitals vanished, tens of thousands gone, the silence inside the camp became absolute. One prisoner, a former naval engineer, pressed his hands together and muttered, "Impossible. That much energy?" Another whispered, "My sister lives in Hiroshima." For the first time, even the most disciplined among them trembled openly. The familiar hierarchy of shame and stoicism cracked. 3 days later, the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The camp loudspeakers carried no announcement, only the evening bugle, echoing across pine trees and wire. But by then, the men didn't need confirmation. They had seen the guards' faces, the sudden caution in their tone. Something irreversible had happened. And then, on August 15th, 1945, the Emperor's voice came through, faint, distant, distorted by shortwave static. For the first time in their lives, they heard him speak directly. They gathered in clusters around radios, their caps in hand, heads bowed. The words were formal, archaic. Endure the unendurable, bear the unbearable. When the transmission ended, no one moved for a full minute. Then, quietly, one man began to weep. The guards didn't intervene. Some stood silently at a distance, hats removed. In that moment, the boundaries of victory and defeat dissolved. For days after, Camp McCoy felt hollow. Work details were suspended. The canteen remained open, but few came. The baseball field was empty. Even the Red Cross volunteers spoke in hushed tones. In the barracks, the prisoners' reactions divided them more than ever. A few accepted the Emperor's words as sacred. Surrender meant obedience, and obedience was duty. Others saw only humiliation. Japan had fallen not through courage, but through annihilation. One officer shouted that he would rather have died than live to hear that broadcast. Yet some, especially the younger men, seemed quietly relieved. "Now we can stop pretending," one said. "We can stop fighting ghosts." Letters began arriving weeks later. Many carried the black ink stamps of destroyed post offices, some the red seal of the American censor. The handwriting inside was shaky, uncertain, sometimes barely legible. "We are alive. The house is gone. Your father was lost." Each letter was both a thread and a wound. Camp officials announced that repatriation would begin soon. There was cheering in one barrack, silence in another. For some, home had become a place of loss, not return. One diary, found years later in a Japanese archive, held a line that captured the feeling better than any report. "They fed us, clothed us, and treated us kindly. And now we return to a land where even the sky has burned." Which side was truly defeated? The final months at Camp McCoy passed in a strange calm. The men packed, traded small souvenirs with guards, hand-carved wooden birds, drawings of the Wisconsin landscape, pieces of barbed wire twisted into rings. A few guards cried quietly during farewells. Before departure, a chaplain addressed them. "You came here as enemies. You leave as men who have seen mercy in its most difficult form, mercy in victory." When the trains rolled out that autumn, snow was falling again. The same sound echoed as before, iron wheels on frozen tracks. But the men aboard were not the same. They were thinner, wiser, and infinitely older. Each carried home a strange contradiction. They had lost everything, yet found a fragment of humanity in captivity. And as Camp McCoy faded behind them, one could imagine a single English word forming on their lips. Halting, imperfect, but heartfelt. Thank you. The journey home was not a triumph. It was a quiet reckoning. The ships that ferried Japanese prisoners across the Pacific in late 1945 were stripped-down troop transports, their decks rusted from years of salt and war. The men stood shoulder to shoulder along the rails, watching the endless horizon as if it could tell them what waited beyond. They expected cheers upon their return, or at least acknowledgement. Instead, Japan met them with silence. The ports of Uraga, Hakodate, and Moji were ruins of steel and ash. Cities that once glowed with electric light now flickered with candle stubs. The smell of smoke still lingered in the harbours, mingling with rot and seaweed. As they disembarked, barefoot children watched from the rubble. No brass bands, no flags, just the sound of wind moving through burned-out warehouses. Many prisoners still wore the PW stencils on their coats, symbols of shame that marked them even after freedom. Neighbours avoided eye contact. Some whispered, "Cowards." They let themselves be captured. A military tribunal clerk stamped their papers, eyes averted. "You may go," he said curtly, as if dismissing ghosts. Home, if it still existed, offered little comfort. In Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, survivors slept in train stations or in the shadows of collapsed temples. Food was scarce. One bowl of barley gruel a day was common. The men who had once been astonished by American hamburgers now found themselves starving again, this time under their own flag. Letters were awkward too. One former POW wrote to his family, "I feared the Americans, but they treated me as a man. Now I fear my own countrymen." The paradox deepened. The enemy had given them dignity, while home offered only judgment. The Japanese government, desperate to rebuild morale, suppressed stories of humane treatment in US camps. Official policy labelled returnees as tainted by foreign influence. Some were forbidden to speak publicly. Others were denied work. Still, fragments of memory survived, quietly passed down in kitchens and workshops, like contraband hope. A man who had laboured in Wisconsin told his wife about snow that fell softly, not like the ash of bombed cities. Another described the taste of Coca-Cola, sweet and strange, like liquid celebration. In small fishing towns, ex-POWs met secretly, sharing recollections that felt almost forbidden. They spoke of guards who shared cigarettes, doctors who refused to call them beasts, and Christmas packages with chocolate bars wrapped in red foil. One of them, Takahiro Mori, later told an interviewer, "At first I was ashamed to have enjoyed anything in captivity. Then I realized, humanity is not a betrayal." The memories became a quiet rebellion against the narrative of hate. In the years that followed, those same men helped rebuild Japan's industries. Some learned English from old camp textbooks and worked as translators for US occupation forces. Others wrote memoirs that circulated in private presses, printed on thin grey paper, distributed among veterans who dared to read them. By 1950, as Japan re-entered the global economy, stories of POW camps began to re-emerge, not as propaganda, but as lessons. A teacher in Yokohama reportedly told her students, "Remember, it was the enemy who showed mercy when we forgot how." That idea, quiet, dangerous, and healing, began to reshape how a generation understood defeat. Meanwhile, across the ocean, in archives and veterans' halls, American guards remembered the same faces. One recalled, "They were terrified, then polite, then grateful. I think we all learned something about what winning should mean." The paradox had come full circle. The war that began with dehumanization ended, for many, in reluctant empathy. The Japanese POWs returned home expecting scorn, and found it. Yet, what stayed with them wasn't shame or starvation. It was the haunting memory of hamburgers and Coke bottles, of a kindness that refused to fit into the enemy's story. Because in that paradox, mercy shown to the defeated, lay the quiet blueprint for post-war peace. And as Japan began to rebuild under American occupation, the men who once laboured behind barbed wire now helped lay the foundations of an entirely different kind of empire. One built not by conquest, but by coexistence. Years turned into decades. The barbed wire rusted, the barracks at Camp McCoy were torn down, and the fields where prisoners once shoveled snow were overtaken by grass. Yet for the men who had lived there, the memories never dissolved. They fermented quietly, like something preserved in the mind's cellar. In post-war Japan, those memories became both burden and compass. Tadahiro Sato, a former sergeant, wrote in 1964, "In America, I first tasted freedom. Not the political kind, but the human kind. I was given a meal without suspicion. His words were controversial, even decades later. Publishers hesitated. Readers accused him of romanticizing captivity. But for Sato, it wasn't nostalgia. It was revelation. Across the Pacific, in Wisconsin, an American farmer still kept a photo taken with POW workers who had helped harvest his fields in 1945. They worked hard, he told a local reporter. And when we sat for lunch, I realized they weren't monsters, just hungry boys far from home. That photograph, faded and creased, outlived the war's rhetoric. By the 1980s, surviving Japanese POWs began holding reunions, not in Tokyo, but sometimes in America. They visited the old camps, now training grounds or museums, placing flowers at sites where the guard towers once stood. One man wept openly in front of a display of ration tins and Coca-Cola bottles, whispering, "This was the taste of peace before we knew peace existed." Historians began to recognize what these camps represented, not just containment, but transformation. Roughly 21,000 Japanese POWs were held in the continental United States, scattered across more than 150 camps. Not one large-scale mutiny occurred, not one mass starvation. Instead, thousands of quiet conversions, not of religion, but of belief. Many of the men returned home determined to live differently. Some became teachers, engineers, or diplomats, who later helped rebuild bridges, literal and cultural, between Japan and America. They had learned something that no battlefield could teach, the strength that comes from mercy. The irony was never lost on them. They had left Japan to defend an empire that promised honor through destruction, and found dignity in the hands of those they had been taught to hate. This wasn't propaganda, one former prisoner said during an interview in 1993. It was reality. And it broke me in a good way. The story of the hamburger and the Coca-Cola was retold in classrooms, documentaries, and oral histories, sometimes as comedy, sometimes as tragedy, but always as a pivot. It symbolized the moment men stopped seeing the enemy as a creature and started seeing him as a reflection. And perhaps that is the quiet genius of it all. America's greatest weapon was not its bomb, nor its tanks, but its abundance. The simple, casual normalcy of comfort. The ability to share it even with those who had sworn to die before surrendering. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. What they carried home, the taste of a hamburger, the fizz of a Coke, the warmth of a blanket in Wisconsin winter, was more than survival. It was the echo of a moral truth too large to fit in any uniform or flag. War strips men of humanity. But sometimes, in the unlikeliest places, a mess hall in America, a paper cup of soda, a kind word from a guard, humanity quietly returns. And that, in the end, is how the story of the Japanese POWs was truly won.